Okay. Hi there. Welcome to Author Talks, where writers are an open book. I am host, writer, and editor Jane VanVooren Rogers, and I am so excited to be here today with author Brian Petkash, who wrote the short story collection Mistakes by the Lake. That is what we're going to be discussing today. So, Brian, thank you so much for being here. So glad to have you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me on Author Talks. I'm excited to chat about the book and about writing and whatever else comes up.
Well, that sounds fantastic. Let me go ahead and show your book cover here, or at least a portion of it in the stream. So, Mistakes by the Lake. So, how did this collection come about?
It started with the novella, which is the final title track story in the collection. I kind of had this idea for what I thought would be a nice modern day retelling of Shakespeare's Henry IV. And I had in my head what I thought was a great voice for my version of Hal. And I was able to crank out 20 or 30 pages fairly quickly. I knew I wanted it set in Cleveland in sort of one of its various rundown parts that I thought might be, experiencing a renaissance at some point in the future. And I thought the novella, what turned out to be the novella, I thought it was going to have the legs to be a novel, but it kind of stalled for a bit. So then I kind of turned my attention to some other pieces. And there was a scene in the early pages that I had written that I kind of had an instinct wasn't going to make the cut when I got down to finishing the novella. So I kind of extracted that out from the novella and worked it to be its own short story. And that story became the first fully written, revised, ready to send out story, which was called In the Shade, which is the second to last story in the collection.
So and then I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to say really quickly. So your hometown is Cleveland, correct?
It is, yes. So definitely, I have a soft spot in my heart for Cleveland. I enjoyed doing the research to learn more about this city that I love, and incorporating elements of it and its history into these stories throughout.
So would you say that you've always been a writer? Have you been a writer since childhood? Have you always been kind of collecting ideas for stories?
I kind of have. I dabbled when I was a kid. I remember there was a contest to write a play in like the 4th grade or 5th grade or something like that. And I remember sitting for hours writing this really terrible play about like the space shuttle and really, if you remember the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick, it was basically that, but with the space shuttle instead. And it was just awful. But I remember really enjoying it, like writing it and telling the story. And I would kind of dabble here and there throughout. In high school, I would do some, and then in college, I took a creative writing course and wrote some stories there. And over the years after college, after undergrad, I would write a story here and there, but really didn't really take to it until really go after it until I was in my 40s.
Well, and I think you bring up a good point there too. I know it's just kind of an offhanded one, but about that you have to not be afraid, I think, to just let yourself create and not judge the work. You got to be willing to write the awful stuff to get to the good stuff, right?
You got to be bad before you can be good.
I think that's good advice, for aspiring writers and current writers out there, because we can all, I think, get too caught in our own heads. And
absolutely, that's totally true. Yeah.
So that's interesting, though, too, that you consider yourself a lifelong writer, just that's always appealed to you. What do you think about writing has always sort of called to you?
I just think the creative act, it's one of those things that I can get lost in the flow of. I had a writing mentor, John Dufresne, talk about in one of the very first workshops I ever took. He talked about how, this thing that you've written, these characters that you've created, they never existed until you sat down and put, pen to paper, or pencil to paper, or typed it onto the computer. And that just really struck me. I hadn't thought of it like that. I hadn't thought of the creative act like that. And I just thought that was such a lovely way to talk about the creative process.
I had heard something a while ago too that had really struck me, and it was more talking about things from like a film or TV side, and thinking that all of those people there on any sort of show like wouldn't be there if the writer hadn't done their work, if the writer hadn't created the show. And I thought that was a really powerful thing too, just to think like, oh my gosh, so if it weren't for the writer creating this work, then none of the rest of it would be there. The
Yeah,
actors
so
wouldn't have
true.
jobs, the
I know,
all
so true.
the
Yeah.
crew and everyone setting up things, and trying to get the right set, and all the stuff.
Mhm.
And I thought that's such a powerful thing to think about.
It is this thing that we create out of thin air sometimes, or with just the very germ of an idea, but how it grows in its own life in its own way, and yeah, it can expand to these wonderful, rich worlds that then pull in so many other people too.
So when you talk about Mistakes by the Lake, and you say that it really started with that novella that then ended up being, shaped and evolving into a short story collection, can you talk just a little bit more about that? Like, did you set out to write about your hometown, or?
I definitely set out to have Cleveland be a big, important character in and of itself, in the novella, for sure. I did not set out to write a short story collection. I set out to write what I hoped would be a novel.
Mm,
And then when I kind of stalled on it, I worked out one of the scenes and made it its own story. And then I had an idea for a story um, about loss and a boy in this awful Halloween costume, this werewolf costume that he got from his mom for Halloween. And I wrote that story, and I knew that story was set in the 80s, but I still didn't really have a concept of what I thought a collection would be. I wasn't really still even writing a collection at that time.
mm,
And and even setting it in the 1980s, that was really just because there's some nostalgia there, but it was also because I didn't want current technology to be a part of the story. So I'm like, how far back do I need to go to make cell phones not be a thing, or that sort of thing? So it's like the 80s will work.
oh, sure.
Um, and then I was researching the city's history a little bit to sort of get into some background of some of the characters for the novella itself. Just trying to see what little elements from history of the city I could drop into these characters' lives as part of their background. And I kind of fell into this black hole of the history of the trolley system in
Mm,
Cleveland. And I didn't even know they had such an extensive trolley system. It was ginormous and used uh, so much by the people there. And I kept researching this trolley system, even though I had no clue uh, how that was going to help me write the novella. It certainly wasn't going to impact the novella in any substantial way, but I was just taken by the background and the details. And I saw an article, just a headline that said a motorman, the guy who operates the trolley, stole a trolley and went on a ride around the city. And
mm,
I just jotted that down as a little side note, just something interesting and fascinating to me. And it kept nagging at me. It wouldn't leave me alone. So I
mm.
ended up writing a story set in 1928 about a trolley motorman who stole a trolley at some point and toured the city. And that became the 1928 story, The Last Ride. And it was when I finished that story, and I really, it's probably my favorite story in the collection. It's when I finished that story that I thought, okay, wait a minute, I have a 1920 story, I have a 1980 story, I have a modern, 2013 story, I have a story set in like 2000. And that's kind of when the concept album style of the collection kind of came about. And then I started researching different details of the city's history in each decade and try to pick out what can I use, in my stories in these decades that might move things forward and kind of complete this collection as I was starting to envision it at that time.
It sounds like you've done a lot of, like, probably a ton of rich and extensive research for this book. That's the feeling that I got, like, from checking out your website, that it was like, oh my gosh, he really, like, there's a whole other backstory here.
There is a whole other backstory. There's a lot of details I left out, that were interesting to me, But then in the revision realized, the reader doesn't need to know this. This doesn't really help the story. This doesn't really move the story forward. It's really interesting, but now it's reading like a history textbook in spots, and I don't need that. So yeah, there was quite a bit of research. I think there's the first story, which is Sky Woman and the Kayagaga, which is set in 1796 and 97. And that one tracks a survey group as they, plot the land in this Western Reserve where Cleveland eventually is located. That one was a lot of research. The Last Ride with the trolley story was a lot of research. The 1940s story called Dispossessed was a substantial amount of research. And that one, that story I cut a lot from. That was probably another 20 or 30 pages longer than it turned out to be. And a lot of what I cut was historical details that just didn't do anything for the story itself. They were just interesting to me. So I have quite a few notebooks full of notes and research and details and factoids and that sort of thing.
Well, that's really impressive that you would embark on, such an in-depth journey to be able to create from, and that you allowed, that research and the history, and then those nuggets of detail about, seeing a headline that inspired your story. So I think that's really cool. And I'm a fellow research geek, so, and kind of history geek. So I also, it's easy to kind of go down the rabbit hole, I think, sometimes with internet research. And
it's so easy. It's so easy.
But I think too, when you're also using that to then inspire yourself creatively, I guess that's one question I have, because I think it's a question that I have, for myself and my own writing too, is kind of how do you determine, like, you were saying that you have so much other research that didn't, or so many other nuggets or details or history that didn't make it into the stories. So how do you determine, when you were creating this, like what belongs, what doesn't, what's like enough detail to make this realistic, but what's like a little too far or too much? How were you able to kind of sift through all that?
I think the characters would drive that more than anything. For example, the trolley story, I had way more notes and way more details about how trolley cars operated. And at some point I needed to know that because I needed to write this character from this close third person point of view of the motorman. So I needed those details to make him believable in that he is this guy who knows how to operate this trolley and has operated it for most of his life. But at some point I had to look at that and go, okay, well, how much of this is really important to show that he knows what he's doing and that grounds the story in this realistic time period of 1928, and how much is just excess stuff that's, again, interesting to me, but doesn't really move the story forward or doesn't add any extra depth to the character itself. So those would kind of go, I would get rid of those details that I just felt. And I don't know if there was necessarily a rhyme or reason. It was just more of a gut feel instinct of this is a detail that needs to stay, and this is a detail that we could probably do without. In writing in general, I like to defer to George Saunders, who's such a wonderful writer and a wonderful teacher. And he talks about this little meter in his head that when he's reading and revising, when he notices the meter's kind of ticking up, in a positive way, okay, we're on a roll here. If the meter sort of flags a little bit and ticks down into this negative realm, then there's something there that needs to be addressed. And I think in revision, I would notice my attention flagging or the meter dipping into that negative area when I saw myself and the story getting bogged down in too many details that just didn't need to be there. So that would kind of be my guide too, as I revised.
That's really interesting. Were you working on this during your MFA program as well?
I did. So I to get into the MFA program, I had submitted an excerpt from the novella, the pages that I had finished for that. So I was mainly going into the MFA. I was a writer who realized I needed deadlines. Otherwise, I wasn't going to get anything done.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought an MFA, this will be good. And I went in really with the mindset of I want to finish this novel. At the time, I still thought this could be a novel. Um, and then as I was working on that and kind of what I already described about how I pulled that one story out and made it its, the one section or the scene and made it its own story, and the 1980s story. So all of those were being worked on and workshopped throughout my MFA. I think I came out of the MFA with 6 or 7 of the stories that are in the collection.
Oh, wow.
All of them in various stages. I think maybe 2 of them were done and ready to send out, and a third was close. The novella, the thing I went in there to finish, still wasn't finished. I think I might have had a very rough draft, and also knew it by then that this was not going to make a novel. And yeah, coming out of the program, I had those stories, and I was starting to submit them to journals while I thought about what to do to fill out the rest of the collection.
It seems like some of it too is just allowing your work to evolve and being open to that. And it sounds like that was something, that you were doing, having gone into an MFA program thinking, okay, I'm writing a novel, and then sort of being open to where the work takes you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you do have to be open that way. For me anyway, if I'm too rigid and locked in, I feel the writing suffers, and I've experienced that if I'm too rigid and locked in and not being open to both what the story is going to allow me to do and what the story needs to be, whether it's, a novel or a novella or something even shorter.
Well, and it seems too like you would have such rich material too, and all of this research that you could always go back and, create something else from that, or go, write an essay about, the trolley system in
Right.
Cleveland or something like that, so that, you can still mine those materials if you'd like, but it doesn't necessarily have to fit in, say, this particular short story.
That's so true. You're right. I mean, definitely the project I'm working on now. I mean, some of the details that I found when I was researching, it's going to be set in Cleveland again. I know that, but why waste all that research I've done on the city? There is a lot that was left out. There's a lot that created some ideas that I didn't work with. That I didn't write a story that went with the collection, and are taking me in different directions.
So when you mentioned earlier about character and some of the inspirations, like with the trolley story, um, how much would you say, I guess, is, sort of character driven or inspiration driven versus, you know, allowing the history or the research to inspire you?
I
Or does it
think
just depend, like, based on, which story we're talking about?
it does tend to depend on which story we're talking about. Certainly, there were definitely some voice-driven stories, like character voice-driven stories. The novella itself is very voice-driven, character-driven, and part of why I thought that novella couldn't sustain to be a novel was because I don't think I didn't think a reader could stand that voice for 300 pages. I felt like 120, 130 pages or so was plenty with that particular voice.
Hmm.
And the 1960s story, Butterflies on Fire, very voice driven, and inspired by an actual Cleveland poet, D.A. Levy. And the language is kind of the language of D.A. Levy's poetry is kind of what inspired the voice that I really leaned into for that. So sometimes it's a character's voice, like those 2 stories. Sometimes it's an idea from everyday life or research. The In the Shade story that starts off with the where's the shade line. That was something I heard someone say, and I just thought it was a great first line to a story. And I just riffed off that. And then other stories like the trolley story that came purely from research. The research primed the pump of my imagination to kind of go after the story a bit more.
It's very cool, and I think it's interesting too how, again, just being open to how that evolves, that sometimes I know you had said with, one of the stories that it came through with a really strong, character voice, and it was instantly more, and I'm forgetting the name offhand which one, I'm sorry, but it's the one, where you were saying it was, on your website, you were talking about how it was really just sort of like a voice that came through at the beginning, a character that was like, I don't know what, I don't know exactly what form this is going to take, but I'm writing in this character's voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that, and I feel even with what I'm working on now, they're also very voice driven. So I'd probably wager that most of my inspiration or whatever comes from this voice driven leaning into and following those characters where they'll take me.
That's awesome. Well, and I know too, you were talking about, so as this collection started to come together and you started to realize it was a collection, then it sounds like you were kind of looking at the time periods and trying to make sure that you had some nice representation there as far as like different eras. Would you say that that was the case?
It was the case. I was definitely going for that. And I had I had really thought the trolley story, the 1928 story, was going to be the first story in the collection. And then at some point when I was nearing, I just had the 1960s story left to write. And for some reason, I'm thinking about the scope of the collection, and I realized that, this city is 200 plus years old. I can't have it just start in 1928. I need a story that goes all the way back to its sort of founding or discovery and whatnot. And then I realized, I need to write another story that goes before all of this. And one of the challenges that I placed on myself in writing all these stories was, because I'm covering such a breadth of time and eras, I wanted to manipulate the writing style, the syntax, the language, such that they echoed the various eras in which they're taking place. I probably succeeded in that as often as I failed, but it was the intent of what I was trying to do, and something that I had a lot of fun with. And some of that came about from, I'd go on the Cleveland library system and I'd pull down old newspapers, and I would read 20, 30, 40 editions of newspapers from cover to cover, every article. Some of it doing the research, some of it looking for details of the era to sort of drop in that people would be cognizant of, characters would be aware of, but also to try to find the language and the voice of those eras and represent them in the stories.
Absolutely. And I do think you succeed at that,
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, because again, and I think that's a really great tip though, too, is reading work from, newspaper stories or other works from the era that you're trying to write to kind of get that language in your head. And I know that you mentioned that too in one of your behind the story sections on your website, where you're talking about, I was reading a lot of, a certain writer at this time. And so I know that some of that, was creeping into, my work. So I guess, do you have any suggestions that way as far as other writers, as far as, what they're reading and looking at to try to capture a certain voice or a time period?
I mean, certainly if you're trying to capture a certain time period, I think reading the newspapers of the time is a strong way to go. But also looking at what other writers have written in those periods that you've liked, and that really resonated with you and made you feel like you were in that era yourself as a reader. So it depends on what what each reader's individual tastes are. And certainly if there is a particular style that ultimately you want to find your own style, right? We read all these writers and we read the ones that we like, and we sort of osmotically bring them into our own essence of writing. So, I mean, if there's someone you're trying to sound like, certainly reading those authors while you're working on your own writing, I think they kind of work across purposes there, you'll start to bring that forth a little bit more to the front. Um, so yeah, I think just reading a lot, reading a lot, reading a lot.
I'd recently heard Ayad Akhtar, who spoke to, I'm working on an MFA at Fairfield, and he had spoken with us about reading Shakespeare. Like just because he was such a master of poetry, and I mean I was not expecting that as like a tip or an insight at all, but it was just like, yeah, and he's a playwright and everything as well, but it was just, I just thought that was so fascinating, thinking of here we are in 2022 and someone saying, yeah, I get up and read Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And it's just because of the language, and that was just sort of mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, Shakespeare and poetry, just reading them both can do so much to energize, I think, one's writing, because they're so Shakespeare poets. A poet friend of mine, George Drew, is on here, and his poetry is just wonderful, and they're so good and precise at vivid language and reducing things to this great essence of just what writing can and should be. And I think we're all striving to be precise in our writing and vivid in our writing, and reading poets and reading Shakespeare and that sort of language can do so much, I think, to enrich one's own writing. And certainly for me, I mean, I took Mistakes by the Lake. The novella is essentially Henry IV, and I use some of the language even from the plays themselves as part of the language in that story.
Absolutely. So once again, we've got that tie-in. So
yeah, it never hurts to bring in Shakespeare.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that the title of this collection is really intriguing too, The Mistakes by the Lake. So we know that, Cleveland is, is a tie, in this collection, and looking at the different eras. What other thematic ties would you say that this story collection brings together?
There was a whole lot in my mind as I was working on these stories. Sort of what makes someone who they are, their core humanity with all the good and the bad that is incorporated in that, how change and loss and trauma affect us and shape us into who we are, shattered dreams, dualities and juxtapositions and divisions and opposing ideas like light and dark, good and evil, hope and despair, triumph and failure, fantasy, reality. All those kind of themes were working in me as I worked on these stories. And then despite all of that somewhat somber sounding, depressing sounding stuff, that there's still this glimmer of hope amidst all of that. So kind of working all of that into thematically, I wanted that to be a thread that ran through all the stories in the collection.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting too, when you think about mistakes, so many times people tend to chastise themselves for mistakes.
Right.
And you don't like to make mistakes, and mistakes can be, embarrassing and uncomfortable, but then it can also be, opportunities for growth and learning and change. And so it seems like there's definitely those kinds of dualities at play, in this collection too.
Yeah. Thank you for picking up on that. That's exactly an element I was going for. And also too, the characters make mistakes. Mistakes are done by them. Mistakes are done to them. The city doesn't really, do what it should do for its populace. And that's in itself a mistake. But ultimately, these people aren't mistakes. These characters aren't mistakes. They have a right to be here. Their humanity is rich and vibrant. And trying to pull that out of the collection too was something I was striving to do.
Well, I see that Wondra Chang is on here live with us, and Wondra had actually connected us on this show. So thanks, Wondra.
And thank you, Wondra.
She's saying that the last story can be a movie, is her comment. So could you talk with us a little bit about the last story in the collection?
The last story in the collection is Mistakes by the
Is
Lake.
Mistakes
It's
by the Lake. Okay, okay. I
yeah,
wasn't sure offhand, so I was like, oh, I
yeah.
just want to make sure I'm not missing
No, that's
anything.
good. It's the novella, so it's the longest piece in the collection. It is the retelling of Shakespeare's Henry IV, set in modern day Cleveland, with a kind of a punk kid and his friends, and including a stand-in for Falstaff from Henry IV, and a kid who's kind of at odds with his dad, and living in his dad's shadow, and trying to overcome the history of what his father has done to him and for him. Uh, it's uh, Sorry, distracted. The
That's
phone is ringing here.
okay.
Um, but really with the story, I kind of used, so many writers work without a net. They're writing with not knowing where they're going, and I think that's a very good way to write. With the novella, I was able to, I had my blueprint, I had the plays, so for the most part, scenes mimic the plays from Henry IV, parts one and a little bit of part two. Uh, but at some point there was a divergence, where my characters weren't going to follow in these characters' path, and the story just kind of took its own way, to get to the end where, not to spoil anything, but Hal has a choice to make, and what choice does he make uh, when he's provided this opportunity near the end is sort of one of the telling moments of the piece.
Mm, yeah, very nice. So I'm just going to interject really quick. So it looks like we have about 12 people watching here live today. So if you guys have any questions for Brian, feel free to just put those in the chat, and we will work those in as we can. So I see that, so you are a former, high school literature and creative writing teacher. And so how much would you say, the writing that you've done also has helped, to kind of, I guess, grow you as a writer and a teacher, and someone who is continuing to evolve, as a writer, and the thing with the, current projects that you're working on? Like, I guess, how would you say that sort of the writing teaching balance is kind of what I'm trying to ask about, and how, things that you've learned, but then also become things that you have taught, and things along those lines.
That's such a good question. That's such a rich question. I think when I was teaching full time, writing and teaching, the balance was very difficult. It was super hard to find and carve out time for my own writing. I taught AP classes, which I love teaching, but there's a lot of essays to grade, and I taught creative writing, and I gave a lot of writing assignments because that's what it is. So a lot of that to grade. So sometimes it was tough. By the time I finished grading 100 essays or 25 stories or a combination of that, I really didn't have the energy to sit down and write my own stuff. The novella started one summer between, summer break between school years. And I cranked out those 20 pages, was very excited about it. And then school started, and I don't think I looked at it again for like a year and a half.
Oh, wow.
So it took a lot out of it. But what's funny is the novella, I was, some of the voice of that character, I was channeling the voices of many of my students, and just how they talked, and was kind of using them as an influence to help me write that when I did get back to writing it. And it wasn't until, I started working part-time as a teacher, that some time started to open up a bit more for me to work on my own writing. And then as far as how did my practice of writing influence how I taught? I remember there was you always hear the sort of old saw about write every day. And I would definitely tell my students, especially in creative writing, you need to write every day. And I would say this knowing full well that I'm not writing every day. And there was at one point when I was teaching creative writing, and I remember saying that to a class, and they asked, "Do you write every day?" And I said, "No, I should, but I don't." And it was then that I would get up an extra half hour early before school, and I would write, so I could actually tell them, no, I am writing every day now. And so that was a neat thing that sort of happened in that teaching space. And also, you learn a lot from doing. You learn a lot from all the mistakes that we make as writers as we try to find our way through a piece. And what I learn, I'm able to bring to them as well, to help them and coach them with their own writing and how they either write an essay or tell a story. And being able to mine my own experiences of this is what's worked, this is what hasn't worked, perhaps this may work for you, was really invaluable in the teaching world.
So are you still writing every day?
Oh, no.
No? Okay.
No. I think I kept that up for about, I think my streak was about 35 days. I think I did, which I've never come close to again. Right now, I try to work on some element of, like, the project I'm working on now. I try to work on some element of it each day. That might not be writing. It might be reading some books for research, and taking some notes and that sort of thing, and jotting down ideas. So I do try to do something toward the project every day, but actual writing or revising something that I've written probably happens just 2 or 3 times a week.
Well, first of all, I find that reassuring. So thank you. Thank you for your honesty. And yeah, and I mean, there are so many things that are coming to mind right now that I want to say. But so one is, like, as a writer who really struggles with being regimented like that, as far as, like, always having a certain schedule, or being well intentioned and signing up for like, as an example, an Honoring the Darkness, like, solstice writing journey. So I signed up for this email thing. It sounded great. My apologies to the person who created that if you end up seeing me saying that, oh yeah, I didn't actually do it. But, like, it sounded fantastic, but I just don't tend to be good at, like, doing little things like that every day, or, like you said, writing every day. And I think that, I don't know, I guess it's just sort of, I may just be over identifying with this, but I just find though that it's just kind of reassuring though to understand that it's like, you don't have to write every day to get something done. You don't have to necessarily be, like, super regimented about your work to be able to finish a collection. So I don't know if I'm making assumptions that I shouldn't be here.
No, I find what you're saying reassuring too. I mean, certainly I have mad respect for those writers who do write every day, and I get it. I get it from the standpoint of, it can keep your characters fresh, when you're engaging them so regularly. I get it that if you sit down and write 400 pages a day, you'll have a novel in, less than a year. I get the advantages to writing every day and having that practice. It just is not one that I've been able to embrace and stick to myself as much as I would like to.
Well, and I also just appreciated when you were talking about that sometimes certain things don't necessarily go together well with trying to do your own creative writing. So when you were talking about grading so many papers and essays, and just how it was draining to your creativity, like, I've been having similar, I guess, debates with myself about, like, okay, do I almost want to have more of, like, a day job to earn money that's not related to writing or editing other people's writing, because I just feel at times like it is sort of an energetic drain on your own creativity. And just that it's like, if you really are trying to create something, I mean, these are just philosophical questions that I've been posing lately, almost like creating this energetic safe space and being like, I'll go do something else to earn money, but I don't necessarily want to be I mean, I guess it's just interesting to me to hear that it's like, yes, you can overdo it on sort of like writing and editing and helping other people with their writing and editing, and then possibly not have quite enough creative juices left for your own
Yeah.
efforts.
And that's how it worked for me, and it sounds like that's how it is for you, or at least you're exploring that. I know writers who are editors of literary journals and whatnot, and get great energy from reading submissions, and it's invigorating to their work. So I really think it just comes down to kind of knowing what works for you and knowing yourself, and then not judging yourself for not writing every day if that's what you hear everyone else is doing, or whatever.
I appreciate, though, that you were trying to put that into practice when you had students asking, basically calling you out on that and going, okay.
They did. I needed to be honest.
I feel that way with my kids sometimes too, when it's like, I'm telling them to, pick up their clothes off their floor and then walk in my room and go, oh, yeah, there's clothes here on the floor. Yeah, sorry. Okay.
Just what I say, not what I do.
Right. So I think we all struggle with those things.
Yeah,
but we're getting a couple questions in the chat. So people are kind of asking, are you working on short stories again, or what are you working on now?
I am not working on short stories. I'm working on what I hope again is going to be a novel. I actually think this one will sustain and make it. It's come and gone in fits and starts, though. I started it a couple of years ago. I'm probably about 80 pages in, but I was about 80 pages in when the pandemic started, and I just kind of shut down. Like, I just wasn't able to work on anything related to that piece. So it's been in the last 3 or 4 months that I've been able to start re-engaging with that novel. And what I've been doing is I've been revising what I had written a couple of years ago, sort of letting the revising of those early chapters help me get back into the headspace of these characters in this time and this place. But it's a piece that's going to be set in Cleveland again, like in the 90s. Really leaning hard into the musical history of the city, because it's got the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It has such a rich musical history. Cleveland was quite the city for launching rock and roll in that term, and breaking new artists. And if a record or an artist could make it in Cleveland, it was destined to make it everywhere. So there's so much history with music in the city that I'm trying to mine and put into this book, which of course means a lot of research. So I have a stack of about 20 books that I'm reading, as well as I try to just get to know more about that history.
Very nice. Well, it sounds like that's well underway, and you've got a lot.
Well underway, and I actually have a lot of times when I've been working on it, or when I was working on it with writing new excerpts or new chapters, I'd sit down and I really had no clue what I was going to write. It was probably just recently, as I've been revising, I actually have an idea of, I know what the next 3 chapters are going to be. I don't know what the full content's going to be, but I know the direction that it's going to go, and that's kind of exciting. So I'm looking forward to getting to writing the new pieces when I finish revising what I've written.
That sounds great. And would you say that you have a professional work that you're doing right now that is a little more conducive to saving that creative energy for your creative writing?
It definitely does. I work from home. I work for a role-playing game and tabletop board game company.
Nice.
And the time is flexible. We have our time that we need to put in, but certainly it allows for space, even in the day, sometimes, to sit down and read for 15, 20 minutes, or I don't take the work with me like you do when teaching. Now that's going to change a little bit. I am going to be teaching a college academic writing class starting next week. So I think we'll see if I can balance it all again, and not lose the steam that I'm getting on working on this novel.
Nice. Well, I wish you luck with that, and I hope that works out
Thanks.
well for you, and that
Thanks, me too.
and that the academic writing course doesn't start to bleed over into, or start to smother your
Yeah,
novels that
well,
you're
we'll see.
working.
I hope not, and let's hope they don't ask me if I write every day.
Right, absolutely. Just we're not going there. So tell us just a little bit about your path to publication with Mistakes by the Lake. So you had this written, and then how did you begin to pursue that?
Um, I started with when I came out of the MFA program, I had, I think, 2 or 3 stories that I thought were ready to send out. So I started sending out to journals. That's kind of what you do. And I thought I got really lucky early on. Within months, I had 3 acceptances. One of the stories won a contest. Another story was a runner-up for a contest. Another story was just picked up. I think combined, those 3 stories only had like 9 rejections.
Mm.
And I thought, man, this is easy, this publication thing. And then the massive cold drought happened, and I was just getting rejections. I think in total, counting literary journals and also sending out the collection to publishers and whatnot, it's probably a couple hundred rejections in total. So it was tough. It became tough, once I got past the wrong belief that it was going to be easy. And then for publication, I just, short story collections aren't typically something that goes to agents. So I was able to kind of rule that out. I submitted the story to whatever short story collection contests were out there. And it was, sometimes it's hard to maintain the enthusiasm or the energy to keep sending out when you're getting rejected. But every now and then I would get, sort of that good rejection where they would compliment your work and say, it was very specific to the work. And they said, we really like this piece. We want you to submit again. This story's just not right for us right now. And you'd get some juice from that. You get some energy from those good rejections. And the same thing happened with the collection as a whole. Some of the contests that I submitted it to, it would end up being a runner-up, a finalist, and finish in the top 3 or the top 5. And that would, just when you're starting to feel like, man, maybe this collection doesn't have what I think it has, one of those things would happen for me, and it would kind of re-energize me, like, okay, there's something there. I need to keep sending it out. And I discovered Mattville Publishing, a woman who graduated from the same MFA program. I saw that she had a poetry collection coming out from this publisher this small press out of Texas. Mm-hmm. And I just emailed the editor and said, are you interested in any fiction? And she said, I'm just thinking about expanding into fiction more. So please send me what you have. And I think within 2 months, she was enthusiastic about it and wanting to publish it. So all that happened rather quickly once it finally happened. And Mattville is just such a terrific publisher of both Wondra Chang, who's on now, and George Drew, who's also on. They're both published through Mattville too. And they've been a wonderful publisher to work with.
That's awesome. That's great to hear that you've had such a wonderful experience and that you were also able to just reach out personally and make a connection and then make it happen. So that's so encouraging. Such a great story to hear.
Yeah.
As the reader, because it just, again, I think that there's just it seems so many, there's just no easy, traditional publishing, hybrid publishing, indie publishing, self-publishing. There are just so many considerations. So that's excellent. And yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. It's been a great experience, all in all.
And I know the book's won multiple awards, and I'm sure that has to feel great as well.
It's been a finalist for a couple of awards, which has been wonderful to see. Yeah. That's exciting. Again, when it gives you some energy to continue working. And of course, some of that energy needs to come from within, and trust that the process of sitting down and writing and what you're working on has some some validity to be written. But yeah, those things help.
Very cool. So it sounds like your novel is in the works, and it'll be great to hear back from you when that's completed and when that's ready to take the next step. So I hope that all goes really well with that, and that you're able to keep writing, even if it's not every day, that you're able to keep making progress.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I hope, yeah, if I'm able to get this novel done and out into the world, I would love to come back and talk about it. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, absolutely. Would love to have you. So, is there anything else, Brian, just that you'd like to share about, either the writing process or encouragement for other writers to stick with it, or anything else?
Um, Gosh, that's a big question. Um,
I'm basically just kind of throwing it to you at this point.
you are, you
Right.
are.
So, what else do you want to talk about? Anything?
I know we joked about not, like not writing every day and whatnot, but ultimately though, you do need to sit down and write. We can think about writing, we can talk about writing, we can um, do research and whatnot, and not to say that throughout the day too. I don't know about you, but in the back of my mind, things are being worked on. That I'm going to hope to get to the page later. Um, but ultimately, it does. There is the discipline of having to sit down and write at some point to make sure that what's in your head gets out onto the page. So I don't know. That's sort of contradictory to the you don't have to write every day, but it's still obviously an important part of writing is the actual sitting in the chair and writing and just kind of fighting through, um, even when you don't feel like it, sitting down and writing. It's always amazing to me. I sit down and I'm not sure what's going to come out. I don't have a plan. I'm struggling over one sentence, and an hour or two goes by, and I actually have some stuff to work with. That's exciting when you actually get that output, no matter how hard the struggle is.
Absolutely. I think you make a couple really great points there. I think one is that even if you don't feel like you're writing, just the ruminating and the thinking about it is is an important piece, that it's almost like you're writing when you're not writing. I think
Absolutely, yeah.
I found that to be true, I think. And so
Hmm.
I feel like that's a good point, but also get your butt in the chair and
Yeah.
you actually have to, do that and produce something, to then be able to keep working on. And it led me to another question, just to think about. So how helpful has having a writing community been, as far as once you've gotten the work created, to be able to share with and bounce ideas off of? And
It's been incredibly helpful. I've been fortunate to be in a writing group. We meet weekly. We've met weekly for a couple of years now. It's absolutely invaluable to me. I mean, that's where I do find, you're not having to read stuff outside of the group. You bring your material and you read it there with them. You bring some copies and then you kind of workshop it fairly quickly. But talk about a place where I get some energy, reading these other people's writings, talking about writing, getting feedback on my own writing has been such a thing to spur me on and to keep me honest too, not just in the writing and what I'm putting on the page, but in staying with it, because each week I want to bring something. So it really inspires me to, okay, let me revise this chapter so I can bring this week and get feedback. And then I work on what their feedback was. And then I can either bring back the chapter that I've revised based on their feedback and get additional feedback, or bring in something new. That whole writing community, and then the extended writing community of like people on this chat with us, so incredibly helpful too, and having those connections and being able to be friends with such talented people who are kind of made their path too, that you can follow and learn from. Yeah, the writing community, building one of those up however one can, is extremely valuable. It has been to me anyway.
That sounds great, and it sounds like maybe it's more on a weekly basis for you now knowing that you're part of a weekly writing group, so maybe the daily thing doesn't quite work as well, but when
Yeah,
you know that you've got that weekly deadline, and again, having a deadline, having that commitment of having to share with other people, I know that that would help, to motivate me as well and to keep me going. So I'm glad to hear, just that you have a practice and a group like that you're working with to help keep you moving.
yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. It has been a godsend.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for being here today. And I just so appreciate you talking with us about Mistakes by the Lake. It's a great collection. I highly recommend it. Just so glad that you were able to be here today. And I also recommend taking a look at Brian's website, which is brianpetkash.com. He has some really great behind the stories, a really nice little section that starts to give insights about the stories behind the stories, and I just love perusing that on your website, and I'm sure that other listeners would like to go check that out too, to be able to delve more into things we didn't get time to go into today.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I had a good time kind of reliving those stories and putting that out there for people to read about the process and where the ideas came from and some of the inspiration and the various pictures that I put up there, some of the historical bits to give some context. So I'm glad you found that useful, and I hope others will too.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this talk, and thanks to everybody who joined in to watch.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much again. And definitely go check out Mistakes by the Lake. Please go like, follow, and subscribe. We've got a page on Facebook, page on YouTube, and trying to get to that first goal of 100 subscribers on YouTube so that I can personalize that, customize that channel listing. So thanks again so much, everyone, for being here and watching and commenting today. And we will see you next time. Take care. Have a great day.